1 o'clock, and I believe it is time that we can commence the Standing Committee on Education meeting scheduled for this afternoon on the 10th of September 2024. Welcome to all members, welcome to Minister, welcome to the officials from the WCED and any of the other officials who are attending. I think we can probably move straight into the business of the day, which is going to be dealing with a briefing by the department on how we can look at different ways of funding our school infrastructure to add to the work that's already been done by the department. And I think right at the initial stage, if we can perhaps just do a greeting and attendance of the various members, and if each body could just indicate your status for the members. I'm Leon van Wyk, the chair of the committee.
Good day, Chair. I'm Donita Stevens, a member of this committee.
Good afternoon, Chairperson and colleagues, officials. Okay. Go, Thomas.
So, my apologies. Thomas Walters, I am a member of this committee.
Good afternoon, colleagues and professionals. I'm Memory Boyson, and I'm a member of this committee.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I am Khalid Sayed, and I'm a member of this committee.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, Minister, Honourable Members, and all officials. Wendy Kaiser-Philander, member of this committee.
Good afternoon, Chair. This is Grant Murray. I'm not a member of this committee, but I feel it's very important to attend this committee today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and colleagues. My name is Rachel Van Vogel, and I'm an alternative member of this committee. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair. Derek Wessels, and I'm an alternate on this committee.
Thank you, all honourable members, for being with us today. I've also been informed that we've received apologies from Honourable Christians, who is a member of this committee, who is away in Zimbabwe representing the WCPP at the accounts conference being held there this is a conference for Southern Africa. So I think we can, with that, we can then just move forward then to Minister David Mania, to the Honourable Minister, we welcome to this committee. And if you can then also just introduce the team from the WCED. Thank you.
Great, Chairperson and honourable members. It's a pleasure to join the committee this afternoon, of course, to discuss some of our ideas about how to use donor or invested funds to assist and support education, and more broadly, how we might mobilize the support of the private sector ultimately to assist us with education here in the Western Cape. The department this afternoon will be led by our Deputy Director General, Sali Abrahams, and I'll ask Sali to introduce himself and the team. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson and members of the committee, Minister, and all other officials on the call this afternoon. My name is Sali Abrams. I'm the Deputy Director General for Education Planning in the WCED. I have the portfolio responsibility for infrastructure and matters of a more broader planning nature. On the occasion of this engagement this afternoon, I will be leading the presentation. I have a technical team that are have supported me to, they're not on this call at the moment, but they're on standby. They've supported me to model the inputs for this particular presentation. We do have, in addition to myself, though, I understand our CFO for the WCED, Mr. Leon Eli, is on the call as well, given the nature of this, potentially the nature of this conversation in the finance space. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks very much for that. And I think I'm going to be just handing back to Minister and yourself, Mr. Abrams, to lead us through this presentation. And I think just for purposes of the process, I think as members we will listen to the presentation and then try and record the numbers of the various slides, if need be, for any questions and further elaboration thereafter. I did have a look through the presentation a short while ago, and certainly I think we are dealing with a fairly complex topic. So I think we look forward to gaining greater insight into this work that's been undertaken, and I think it is fairly novel and very important work that has been done to have a look at how we can involve a greater pool of funders and investors into the education market. So I'm handing back then to you, Minister, and to Mr. Abrams. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm happy to hand over to Sali Abrams to take us through the presentation, and we look forward then to taking any questions from members of the committee. Thank you.
I think you're still muted, Mr. Abrams.
My apologies, Chair. Through you, I'd like to flight the presentation I will share this afternoon. If you could, if Wasima could let me know, Ms. Hassan-Musa could let me know if it's visible on your end.
It's visible, Mr. Abrams.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's an important conversation that we need to have. It's a matter of both international and local debate when it comes to the discussion on the challenges and opportunities to generate more funds for education. It's probably timeless as well, given the debates around whether current financing levels in the education sector is adequate, whether it is efficient, and whether it's equitable to ensure that quality education can be provided to all who seek access to it, and whether we can improve learning outcomes. We know that South Africa spends 6% of its GDP on education, which ranges from pre-primary through to tertiary, which represents in itself in excess of 20% of total government expenditures. But we understand the context that we have emerged from, which is learning trajectories and learning outcomes have been impacted, of course, by COVID initially, and then subsequently as we navigate the post-pandemic environment, the current backdrop of our operational challenges in terms of funding and the department's position that we are underfunded in the way that we believe we need to be in order to tackle not just serving those that we serve in the Western Cape, but also as we attempt to restore those learning trajectories and improve learning outcomes. It is a very timeless conversation, so thank you very much for the opportunity for me to share ideas in this regard. These will be ideas, Chair. These are subject to further consultation. I will make two propositions during this presentation. The immediate challenge is to firstly contextualize what we mean by underfunding and gives a little bit of context to not just the education financing gap, but specifically to the agenda of infrastructure, which we see as a critical enabler and a priority for us to invest in. And it is important that we do recognize that it will take some innovation and some strong will and support from a number of stakeholders, not just from the executive authority, but as we plan and establish roadmaps to pursuing innovations as it regards alternative financing models. I think the first thing we want to recognize is that this will take some courage, and so we're presenting our ideas quite transparently this afternoon. The innovation that we've pursued as a priority is in regards to service delivery, trying to find efficient ways to spend the monies that we do have, and I'd like to illuminate that this afternoon, and look at particular innovations towards improving the efficiency of spend, making sure that money is going in the right direction, where it can have the biggest impact. But we're also starting to think about and building momentum with innovations that pursues additional funding or financing from both domestic and international markets. And so the innovations are twofold. One is, let's look within the current financing and fiscal envelope. Let's look at where the monies are going. Infrastructure, program 6 within the WCD vote. It's quite a significant one. It's around the 2.5 billion rand mark at the moment. It's been sustained at 8% of the total vote. And so we're very grateful for the confidence that Western Cape government has given to the education infrastructure agenda and committed that sustained level of funding. But we do, as a point of departure, want to make the point that it's not enough. And so whilst we are efficient, immediately the premise is, and the point of departure of this conversation is, we do need to consider how do we mobilize alternative funding. And so against the backdrop of the national fiscal emergency, as we think about the funding required to address a broad set of operational needs, amongst it, of course, looking at the biggest cost drivers, our salaries of our teachers, but also the non-personnel costs, infrastructure amongst them. We know that to recover the learning trajectories of many poor learners, particularly who have been impacted, we do need to seek those opportunities quite aggressively. And so as we move forward, I do want to make that acknowledgement that whilst the Western Cape government, and notably also non-government agencies, donors, and perhaps also importantly households, who have been contributing to dealing with the education need financially, it does place a significant burden on households, particularly poor households, to have to contribute to the cost of delivering quality education. And so it's with that intent that in both recognizing the contributions that are being made, we do also, of course, think about our role as government. And so as we move into this particular pursuit, I make the point that despite the sustained funding allocations, the 8% in this particular program, the 8% allocation to program 6 within the context of vote 5, the unmet infrastructure demand is significant. We've taken an opportunity to assess that demand. This is the demand for capital funding. This is the demand that we think we do need to engage to grow the system, to replace dilapidated and rapidly declining infrastructure, and to augment the current infrastructure with newer technologies that allows us to be more efficient and sustainable in the way that we deliver education services. So the 15 billion rand that's illuminated on slide 1 is meant to illuminate the demand view that we have as we go into the 7-year trajectory or the 6-year trajectory now to 2030. It does quantify the backlog of schools that we believe we need to meet the historical growth of the last 5 years, but also the anticipated growth over the next 5 years. And added to that, running the older school estate has implications for the monies we have to spend to maintain the integrity of the particular assets that are under our care. This presentation, therefore, is as we move into a discussion initially on the public and private funding options, is meant to illuminate the extent to which the public financing has been carrying this particular program. We have recently augmented the allocation to the program in the 2024-25 year with a pursuit of an additional allocation from the budget facility for infrastructure, and through the Windows 7 process run by the National Treasury. We had been informed in April and May of this year that we have provisionally been approved to be allocated an additional 2.5 billion rand over the 2024 MTEF. And so significantly the confidence that we have built with articulating our demand, the confidence that we've built with presenting and proposed approach on how and to what extent we will use additional public financing in the way that it can register impacts that are needed. We've been able to derive some learnings and a small measure of success in the way that it has given us input and considerations for how we might engage the private sector and other funding sources. And so that's a positive aspect in the way that we had gotten feedback on our approach to augmenting the current allocation of funding. In addition to that, our collaboration schools model in the province, which we are still piloting, we have 10 schools currently active, a proposal to expand not just the development of new schools, but also to expand the collaboration schools model in the way that we extend the opportunities to further research the optimal shared governance model across another 5 schools have attracted an estimated 300 million rand in funding. That's both donor and philanthropic funding, but also private sector contributions in the way that the project preparation is done for those projects, so crowding in some funding. And then we've also launched the Edu Invest program at the tail end of 2023, an initiative that we had pursued in order to both fuel innovation and engage the private sector and other non-governmental agencies more constructively and more systematically in the way that we would want to promote investment into education firstly, and as a priority into education infrastructure, which is capital intensive, which is slightly longer term. And so we are starting those conversations on what it might mean to institutional investors, particularly those who see infrastructure in this social infrastructure in the education space as an opportunity, the likes of pension funds, the likes of insurance companies, who prefer the longer term aspects. We started to think about what might make it attractive to those institutional investors to invest into the space. And so a multifaceted approach to augmenting our finance allocations, public finance allocations, which we derive, of course, through the conditional grant, sustained, albeit at historical levels, at around 1.2 billion rand a year for the next 3 years. We've been adding to that, as shown there, over the MTEF, another 2.5 billion rand from BFI, 300 million as it stands in pledge support from donors and philanthropists and other agencies. And then our equitable share, which, whilst we were working hard to protect frontline services, given the funding shortfall with the wage agreement, infrastructure was unfortunately one of those particular aspects of the budget that have to be scaled back. And so there was a cut of circa 1.3 billion over the MTEF on infrastructure, but these augmented funding sources will go a long way towards closing that gap and augmenting what we have. So as we go into the establishment of partnerships, important to illuminate our processes of how exactly we've gone about that and what we are learning in that regard. Well, through our pursuit of different particular schooling types and institutional mechanisms, in testing the demand, it is clear that the demand for education is high, not just contextualized by the growing population, but also the demand for access to quality schooling, whether they be in the public or in the private realm. And with the Edu Invest emphasis on low fee, no fee sort of context, looking at the opportunities to expand independent schools that serves that particular targeted community of learner, the demand is very high, and I think it becomes then a design challenge for us in moving forward with anticipating that in a school choice environment, we could probably expand opportunities across different sectors. And so we've looked at opportunities to doing that. We looked at the legal and regulatory framework, which of course is relevant, quite a complex and comprehensive set of regulatory controls around partnerships, and particularly as we think about the context for education, public-private partnerships. We do have initial feedback and inputs that suggest that the current frameworks are supportive of efforts to expand education with partnerships. And so we continue to explore that. Our World Bank education sector analysis, which we have concluded and are preparing to launch in terms of its report findings and outcomes and suggestions and recommendations moving forward, has made very specific policy recommendations around how we proceed with establishing new partnership models in the way that we catalyze and the way that we incentivize crowding in additional funding into education and also into education infrastructure. And Chair, through you, I make a strong link that investing in infrastructure or attracting investment into infrastructure is not enough. Private sector is fairly reluctant to invest into infrastructure given its capital intensity, given its high risk, and it's a fairly illiquid investment. And the challenges, in addition to that, in the social sector are multiple. And so there are a number of risk factors that one would have to consider in the way that the private sector perceives opportunities to invest into not just education, but then infrastructure, which in itself as a sectoral focus is a very complex environment, again, heavily and regulated and very complex to engage. There's risk all over the place. And so we've had that feedback from donors and other institutional investors around, what those risks are, and really thinking about how we find the incentives to expand the private sector, thinking very acutely around those risks, and then finding intermediaries that could help us manage for those risks. And I'll speak a little bit about the instruments in that regard, whether those be credit guarantees, whether those be other instruments that are used. But first and foremost, we look at our current partnerships and, of course, the school operators that operate within our collaboration schools, strengthening the oversight and making sure that those school operators in a partnership context are held to account. We continue to learn and invest capacity into making sure that we get that management and oversight right. And, of course, clarifying the roles and responsibilities, not just of operators, but also of school governing bodies. And then targeting who we want to support with additional funding, making it more accurate to the disadvantaged learner, or the learner that would benefit from this intervention, as opposed to universally kind of spreading additional funding. Finding the right targets in how we want to mobilize funding and to whom the benefit should be is something we're given great attention to at this stage. So the point is that to spend funds on expanding access alone is not important, as it's not sufficient. It's also imperative to improve the quality of the skills that we produce. And indeed, one of the learnings I alluded to from the BFI application is it wasn't an application only about deficient infrastructure or the large and growing capacity backlogs of not enough classrooms and failing infrastructure. Even, if I made the case about worsening weather patterns and conditions with climate change, investing into infrastructure wasn't seen to be commercially viable and lucrative enough. We had to add that developing the skills and the outcomes that we would pursue in building new schools, that in itself was then formulated as the central piece of our justification for pursuing more public financing. And it will be our pursuit of private financing to talk about not just building new schools, but also to drive better learning outcomes and better opportunities within those new schools. And those are seen as attractive features in the way that we close the inequality gap and make quality education more accessible to many more that need it. So as we go into, as I spoke about more generally about our private and particularly as I started the public funding options, just to confirm to the committee that, of course, we now have an expanding base of funding sources to the infrastructure agenda in education in the Western Cape. Our pursuit of exploring really most, if not all, of the public avenues that we can. We have one or two more avenues to pursue. But in addition to our conditional grant funding and our equitable share, we've now pursued the budget facility for infrastructure, which I spoke about, the preliminary allocation. It's been afforded for this 3 years. Donor funding in the way that we're looking at augmenting our funding into capital development and new schools development. We have a number of projects we can report on and we've learned from in the way that we build those partnerships. And then I spoke about where the partnerships are in fact broader education partnerships, where we co-invest in infrastructure. We have looked at, of course, what it will take to set those projects off on the right footing for the long term. And so across the public and now increasingly private funding options, we do have a broader base. We haven't pursued borrowing or other debt instruments to augment yet. We thought we'd focus on the channels that are more immediately accessible to us as facilitated by the provincial and the national treasuries, and we're very grateful for that. But as we go into the MTEF 2024 year and into the 25 year, of course, looking at that Program 6 budget, I think it's important, Chair, to share with yourself that, and the committee, of course, is that our infrastructure objectives is largely focused on ensuring that we deliver sustainable solutions, but that we supercharge that there's clearly a responsiveness, an unprecedented level of responsiveness that's required in order to meet the needs, and it's a growing and diverse set of needs in terms of infrastructure. We run the older school estate, and we have a number of schools that are not meeting the minimum norms and standards for public school infrastructure. And we do have to nuance the notion of growth. Growth is both population growth, but it's also about levels of attainment that we're seeing, obviously, the contemporary cohort reach. I mean, highest levels of grade attainment are being recognized in the way that new high schools and a varying base of high schools will need to be delivered, not just in the urban centers, but the demand is probably most excessive in the rural context, in the districts of Bitu, and the Oeverstrand, Theewaterskloof, Saldanha, the Swartland, etc. There are a wide-ranging set of needs as it pertains to the need to build new assets, new schools, as well as to develop, upgrade, and enhance the few that we have that are showing signs of degradation with being overused, excessive enrollment. And so we've got our work cut out, Chair, to really look at the portfolio. And as we look at the 3-year trajectory, 8.65 billion rand, which includes the BFI preliminary BFI allocation, means that we needed to think about that spread of monies. We don't have separate budgets to protect assets that are currently existing, as opposed to budget for new school development and acquisitions. It's one portfolio, and we have to balance that portfolio in the way that we grow the system and expand the system, in addition to maintaining the assets. And as we said, probably the largest asset base in Western Cape government, near on 80 billion rand asset base, which needs to be maintained given not just climatic conditions, but worsening cases of social issues, vandalism, theft, etc., means that there's an impact on the system. So that's our planned distribution of spend across the portfolio. A third of the budget goes to maintenance. That's influenced by a DORA stipulation to use conditional grant in a particular way. But we do want to get closer to maximizing our new school investment sub-program to about 50% of that. And given that 2.5 billion rand had been provided through the BFI, we did want to illuminate that this would be extraordinary. We're reaching levels of investment into new schools infrastructure that we wouldn't have seen before. It would have been just under 40%, 38% before. We're really pushing on putting the additional funding into new school development and creating new opportunities. On the right-hand side, just a distribution of those funding sources. So we can see the EIG contribution is fairly stable. Our concern over this MTEF is in the middle here, as we think about that 469 million rand allocation as part of the equitable share. But we have a good allocation in the way that the BFI team had distributed its funding or proposed to distribute its funding. The 1 billion rand in the purple bar allows us, as you can see, Chair, from that profile of cash flow, we'll have a steady and increasing budget allocation to Program 6 over the next 3 years, largely helped by BFI. Prior to that, you can see the really challenging situation with having to start schools or investments in this particular year without having continued and successive funding. So the volatility and the unpredictability of funding is a key feature of this budget, and I need to illuminate that as we set the scene for how might we use new funding coming into the system and what might we use it on. But the 8.65 gives us an amount that we think we can work with. We've distributed that across the various sub-programs in the way shown. We've very happy to speak to the rationale for why we keeping that maintenance at 35%, given the need to address backlogs and the kind of operational challenges that we've got with accelerated degradation of infrastructure. This is a big challenge for us, but committing initially 800 million rand up to 1.1 billion rand in the out year of this MTF is an adequate, in our opinion, allocation given the demand for new infrastructure. And I do show in this particular slide the 300 million rand, which will cut across not just new assets, but also to upgrade our current assets. So that's where the 300 million rand that was pledged for collaboration schools would go, and we're expanding our focus in that regard as well. On the right-hand side, we see an in-year view on the budget picture. But the first proposition that I think we'd want to talk about as we go forward, Chair, is that mobilizing additional investment, having contextualized why we think we need the level of investment that we do. We've promoted not just that we'd want to refresh and convert and upgrade the historical legacy that is our school estate with a rapidly declining asset base, but we're talking the language of creating new opportunities. And we're creating new opportunities, particularly at the high school level for 12 to 15, but that doesn't mean we don't have our work cut out in planning for how we might universalize access at the lower end of the spectrum at ECD and the reception years, in addition to foundation learning. So we know that across the pipeline of education, basic education delivery, we do need significant more investment to deal with legacy and the current asset issues, but to grow the base and grow quality school options, we need more investment. And the focus had been and continues to be on making sure that the current levels of spend, that 8.65 billion, which is a significant amount of public finance, but in the context, not enough. We do want to be accountable to how we spend that before we seek additional funding. And as we seek additional funding, we recognize the challenges then in the way that we might want to incentivize and attract that. And there are three features that I'd want to point out as we're pursuing that. It is about the scale. We do run 1,544 schools. 70% of them are beyond the end of life. In other words, there's a risk of asset failure. We do recognize that we have sustained levels of growth, 2.5% of growth. We anticipate another 130,000 learners between now and 2030. We do think about the scale of our investment, and we do think about long-term capital options to build in excess, as I pointed out earlier, the 60 schools we need right now and the potential 114 we need to 2030. We do need to find ways to catalyze and crowd in those capital funding. And in doing so, the third aspect, in addition to recognizing scale and timing, we do need an intermediary to help us build a pipeline of bankable projects. The commercial viability of schools, of course, in the public sector will always be a challenge. And so to catalyze that by using public fundings or other philanthropic funding is something that's really near to our thought process at the moment. Our focus, though, in the department right now is about building that pipeline. And so as I've shared through this presentation, to quantify the demand and to provide direction to those that we are looking to engage in partnership to build out the infrastructure capacity we need for the schooling system in the Western Cape. I spoke a little bit earlier about the 130,000, and we're moderating that to on service parameters, not just in high schools, but on primary schools, closer to the 110,000 mark, but it's still, of course, subject to a number of influences, not just population growth, but also government policy. I mean, we'll be very, very progressive in the way that we're financing learners with special needs and accommodating them. We have done a little bit more to accommodate learners in technical and vocational environments. And so that in itself might bring learners back to schools. And so the number is in proximity, but that is translated to the capacity we need. And I spoke about the 60 schools that we're looking to build, which will have a measure of School of Skills as well. The cash flow profile, 10 billion rand on growth, 5 billion rand to do expansion and upgrade. These are mathematical modelings based on capacity that we think we can generate to drive the build of new infrastructure over the next 7 years. And these are indicative infrastructure demand items which will be shared in nuanced form and in refined form with our partners. Where would we spend the money? A critical priority for education infrastructure is, of course, to deal decisively with our admissions pressure. But not only in the way that is obvious that we need more schools, we need more quality schools. And I made the link between speaking the language of not just building, expanding access, but expanding quality education. And that comes in the forms of making sure that the school environments we create, the facilities that we land, are beyond the pragmatic basic school infrastructure that we've landed so far. Classrooms, we need laboratories, sports fields, cultural centers, technology-enabled environments. We do need significant investment into creating quality learning. So whilst the quantum of how many schools we will build is important, every school that we choose to invest in and build new capacity in needs a decisive plan on the quality of education it will offer. So the first category is to deal with growth. And we think the partnership angle and the incentive we will look to create to not just expand public schools, but to expand the base of private schools that can serve low fee learners. That's an important area where we think we'd want to mobilize monies into. Items 2 and 3 are government responsibilities by and large. We work with our colleagues to ensure that we can protect the integrity of our asset base with meeting minimum norms and standards, and that's replacing schools where we can. The opportunities that emerge are in the areas where we can mobilize corporate social investments, big corporates that would want to make sizable social impacts, pension funds, again, long-term players, but not only in the financial industry, in other industries as well. We think there are opportunities to rehabilitate and replace aging school infrastructure and creating new opportunities out of it, particularly in local economies in the rural context. Overcrowding and congestion, putting money to relieving the service delivery pressure, particularly in underdeveloped township areas, in sourcing in private sector and other funding to do school development, and particularly new school development, will allow government to free up some resources to deal with an issue that we know is a high priority for infrastructure to engage with, and that's dealing with overcrowded classrooms, particularly in no and low fee school context. And then the fourth item at the bottom of the screen, Chair, is about really thinking about a fiscal strategy that would help the innovation agenda. We do need to think about unlocking new opportunities, but at a unit cost, at a price point that is lower than the 20,700 Rand that it costs us to educate a child right now. Building technical schools and vocational schools of skills are very expensive endeavors. And if we aggregated the cost to build those schools and to operate those schools at the learner-teacher ratios that are required, dividing that by the number of children that are impacted, those unit costs are not efficient. They're not value for money right now in the way that we could probably talk about value to the beneficiaries that are there, but the broader mass of children who need to access quality education, the price point is still too high. So we're looking at ways to transform and reform the service delivery model of schooling and find new opportunities. And so crowding in monies to support those policy ideas around how we might adjust schooling types is an opportunity area. So talking about the catalytic funds, access and quality hand in hand, obviously our biggest areas of focus for public expenditures. If we are able to attract more funding in, we can look at making monies available to expand access and coverage, but there's a very nuanced and very closely tied commitment to ensuring that every new school we build has an element of sustainability, but also offers more opportunity to those who school in it. The social demand I've spoken about, even across the independent schools, are high for low-fee sectors. We do appreciate and acknowledge that government has increased its public funding share to 37%, and I've commented on the median of the 9 provinces of just over 20,500 Rand to educate a public school learner is something that we keep as a benchmark metric as we think about sustainable solutions in the infrastructure and schooling space going forward. And that hangs as the front end to really what's shaping our organizational focus at the moment. When we talk the language of expanding access to quality, the metric we'll keep in mind is the per learner unit cost. Again, against the backdrop of our current operational pressures, the operational costs of teachers and support resources, we're looking at what it will mean if we, pronounce moving with quality education in every new school that we build, particularly in the no and low fee context, we need to get a price point, as it were. And so we've got the reference points that suggests the current method of building out schools at the price point that we're building out schools is not sustainable. And what we instead need, alternative education school service models or school types that will lower costs. In other words, the price per learner, we can reduce that to below the 20,500 Rand. We want to offer differentiated instruction. In the modern context, the role of the teacher as the facilitator of learning. We're looking at the demographics and the features of our teacher supply in the Western Cape and scaling that up, given other research around what that might mean for us over the next 7 years as we talk expansion. And at the same time, test and appropriately consider new models of schooling, whether those be digitally intermediated learning processes or other methods of schooling. Alternative education service models gives us a point to pursue broadening access to quality whilst keeping the price down in the operational sense, not necessarily only in the infrastructure and capital investment sense. And so who are we targeting? Well, initially, we think that the low fee, no fee sector, if there is demand, particularly in areas that public schooling is not reaching just yet, expanding the base of independent private schools that could lift and help lift some of that demand. That is certainly an area that private sector partners see as an opportunity in the Western Cape. It's the 7% enrollment in private schools in the Western Cape is almost half of what it is in Gauteng at 14% at the moment, and that's largely due in the let's quote unquote the market that private schools are operating. We have very good public schools operating in the Western Cape at that level. But we are looking at subsidizing private schools, again, targeted, that focuses on low fee, no fee learners. I mean, the vast majority of schools are low cost, independent schools are low cost schools. We subsidize 102 out of the 300 or so independent schools. And so finding an appropriate mechanism and a scaling mechanism to subsidize those schools. And as we've discussed earlier, expanding collaboration schools is important, is an important opportunity and probably a logical one to pursue at this stage as well. And so just on expanding the base of subsidized independent schools, and the context here, Chair, is of course the nearer term opportunities beyond expanding public school offerings like collaboration schools, the nearest term opportunity to crowd in private sector funding in a way that it alleviates some of the service delivery pressure and it engages the demand for access to quality education in the low fee, no fee context. If we are able to find the appropriate strategies and mechanisms to incentivize the expansion of independent schools that serves that particular demographic of learner, then we are going to pursue that within the legal and policy framework. As I've said up front, we're confident that there's space to do that, but we'll do that in a way that is obviously responsible and that we don't, lose sight of exactly all the dynamics that one needs to consider in delivering quality education to that particular demographic of learner. And so strengthening accountability and oversight and really thinking about the design of these models going forward. How do we create incentive that's both legally sound and policy sound, but also in a way that's responsible and sustainable for the future? It is a near-term opportunity, but it does need our very best thinking with a number of agencies and partners to be able to make this work. And we do that in conjunction with other provinces like Gauteng and others who are thinking in similar lines at this stage as well. One of the innovations we've moved forward with as we move a little bit more into the complex, is a little bit more complex, it's certainly still near term. We've looked at innovations in the way that we partner with other developers, non-traditional developers of schools, housing developers. And we've had an opportunity that we've tested for its legal soundness. It's a project that we're pursuing right now. Housing developer approaches the WCED with an opportunity to rent to it without obligation, a school that the developer believes, is a big draw card for a housing estate that it's developing. It proposes to work with the department on the design, ensuring that it meets minimum uniform norms and standards for public schools, but that it takes the turnkey approach to developing that school through its phases, including dealing with the land use rights and some of the other planning and design aspects, constructing that school and turning it over on a lease basis. And as we think about those opportunities, of course, I mean, this is not a different mechanism to secure schools. In each step, there's, financial, legal, and technical due diligence that we apply, that we're not about to mislead private sector in the way that we pursue our acquisition strategy for new schools. But this is something that's driven from the outside in, as it were. These are opportunities that housing developers see that schools will be a big incentive for them. And so we drive this on a lease to own basis, certainly in terms of its concept, but it's without obligation and a full due diligence by our Department of Infrastructure counterparts in terms of value for money and all the other market conditions. That's first assessed. And so we're renting, moving to rent a school in the Dunoon area, and I think we'll go into the processes to acquire it. So that's again an innovative way to transfer the risk to the private sector, to develop that, to deal with the capital intensity issues and some of the high initial costs and risks, and then government then leverages that in a way that it doesn't have to commit obviously the capital up front, but it does also share some of the obligations as we think about institutionalizing a new school. The other innovation, which is closer to the agenda of dropping the price point, is about blending and offering hybrid education. Now, this, Chair, is not e-learning in and of itself. This is on the spectrum and probably best dovetailed between the very best of the facilitation work and the teaching work that teachers do, the tutoring, the coaching, the supporting, the facilitating learning, but using technology as a mechanism to engage a broader set of learners. And we have a school in Yesterofie right now that is modeling what we think a more optimal state of blended learning could look like. Good, accurate definition of the roles of teachers and assistants in the classroom, but that also uses technology in a way that it is serving a poor learner that doesn't necessarily have the self-direction. It is a very well orchestrated process. The teacher has scripted lessons. The technology is a tool that plays a role, but the learning processes are enhanced, and the evidence of that are the learning outcomes. Apex, the school that's trialing this, is showing outcomes that are comparable and are outperforming its peers in similar contexts, and significantly using the 20,500 Rand per learner price point that we average out to in the public sector. It delivers that education at a cost of around 16,500 Rand per learner. And so we think about the economics of how do we expand access at scale, but keep the price point down. Of course, the issue of sustainability and effectiveness we'll continue to evaluate as we move forward. But the design and the formulation of that model is something that's still under development, and that is seen as another policy shift that, if we do expand on it, has drawn a lot of interest from private sector partners, potential partners who want to invest not just into school building, but school building with technology intermediation, school building plus technology intermediation plus teacher development. And so these are innovative pursuits of finding more money and directing them into the right places. And then looking forward as we conclude this presentation, Chair, with your permission, we're looking at blended financing and to craft there's no single definition, but to craft a definition for a blended finance approach. And again, just as I close out, our pursuit of innovations has been initially to look at our current service delivery to try and drive efficiency of spend in the current models, and then innovating, let's call it around the fringes, in terms of using technology and using other mechanisms to get more value for money. Big capital intensive new school development projects need us to think not just about the building of the facilities, but also what's happening in the classroom. And so we continue to explore ideas around putting money to buildings and then technology, and then also teacher development as we mobilize teaching and learning in these new environments. But that sits as a precursor to a more broader fiscal strategy to pursue blended finance that allows us to get more monies on a longer term basis into the pipeline. And I spoke about the large scale, large capital kind of scenario. We do need to quantify, as we did, the bankable projects, and then use public and philanthropic money to improve the risk and return profile, or in other words, to address the commercial viability of investments for private investors, both institutional and also donors. And so these innovative financing solutions, there are multiple. I mean, blended finance is very helpful and useful in the way that it allows government, and particularly as we talk about the role that multilateral development banks can play as intermediaries that can catalyze this, a lot of that upfront risk with new school development. Private sector, as I've said before, is not necessarily incentivized to deal with that risk. And so the role that government plays in proposing a portfolio of projects that will go through the planning, design, build, and potentially the operate phases, thinking more broadly about building these assets out over a longer term horizon of 10, 15, or 20 years. These are seen as opportunities the private sector would want to engage in. And so, of course, the financing aspects and the opportunity is significant, but the capacity we need to do appropriate project preparation and to structure these particular portfolio of projects that we can partner between government and other agencies, private and other non-governmental agencies, in the way that we crowd in funding. We have to think very clearly through what those project pipelines and portfolios of projects are. But this is a hugely appropriate but also exciting area. It's not without the risk that we have to look at. Significant investments into schools infrastructure over the next 10 years, 10 to 15 years. It's a longer term endeavor to pursue blended finance. But it is something that we are really clear needs to involve a number of stakeholders, including this particular oversight committee chair, but also our stakeholders that are in our space at the moment, international development agencies, working with private investors and multilateral sort of agencies, bringing a number of stakeholders to the table, building task teams across ministries and governments to design for these types of projects, local government and provincial being clear areas of focus at the moment. We do have to mobilize the teams around making this happen, and education presents, in addition to electricity, probably the next biggest area of interest to private investors in the local currency markets based on the feedback from the World Bank and other sources. And so education is right up there. If we are able to package the investable projects properly, deal with the risk issues and engage technical expertise, we can probably pursue this. And so project financing in the interim, short-term donor philanthropic funding into new school development, particularly that speaks the language of quality education, Chair. Over the longer term, blended finance, looking at longer term investments, broader roles for private funding, and obviously opportunities in the way that it deals with risks and generate returns. It is clear that we have the opportunity. Right now, our focus is on making sure we've got the right projects, and then, as necessitated by the current context, making the case that education is an investable space. And so all of the work that we're doing at the moment is just readying the field for a blended financing environment, but it is early days on an idea that we think is a significant part that must be integrated in our funding discussions for a sustainable future. Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it at this point, and we'll invite questions from yourself and the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Abrams, for that very inspiring presentation that you've given us. I think it's absolutely fantastic what you've indicated there, and it's not a question that I'm going to ask right now, but perhaps just that you can prepare yourself, because it's in some ways you've described a candy store with all sorts of exciting possibilities, and And I'm saying using the word candy store because I'm aware of certain investors who want to get into education, and they like the kiddies standing outside that candy store and want to rush in. And it would appear that they've got money in their hand and they're not quite sure that they want to buy. And that's the question I want to pose a little bit later while my colleagues have first bite at it. So just a thought on the sharpening of the pencils on how does one deal with these possibly exciting investors that we have. I've seen that Member Walter's hand has been up for some time, and and then I see Member Sayed, so I'm going to give the two of them a chance to have first bite at the candy available.
Thank you, Chair. I got stuck there for a moment with things popping up on my screen. I need some of that online training that was referred to in the presentation. Chair, let me first start by saying I think your summary of a good candy store, exploring lots of innovative options in a responsible manner. That came out very well in the presentation, and I think there's definitely forward thinking here. I've two very specific questions. One is, if you're looking at private investors, specifically I can't remember what exactly the term was that you used, but the development model where a school facility along with the housing facility gets developed, the risk get mitigated for the department. That particular model sounds to me like there's quite a transversal element between different layers of government and different departments involved. For example, if you want to scale such a model, you will proactive zoning and inclusion in IDPs at municipal level will most certainly play a role. I can imagine if it's dealt with in a similar manner that the province is dealing with an ease of business, doing business approach, while an ease of investment in education and removing unnecessary delays in the process would require a transversal approach between layers of government. And also, if you look at the objectives of the Department of Sport and Cultural Affairs to resuscitate school sport and fully utilize and expand the usages of libraries, I also see potential there for a dovetailing. So my first question is, what would your views are? What were the thinking in that regard? I think scalability, you might find a model that works quite well, but it takes years to start scaling it and institutionalizing it as an approach. It's the kind of thing one arguably would want to see happening within 2-3 years rather than 20 years, for a new type of educational system to emerge. So scalability, that's my first question. And how do you foresee transversal cooperation between the various levels of government? Secondly, in terms of scalability, if you have a workable set of models, what's the thinking in terms of rapidly implementing and institutionalizing it? I would imagine that requires a lot of work in terms of legislation at possibly all levels of government. And then also in terms of securing investment, you referred to interacting with various corporate actors. Can you give maybe examples of what type of corporate actors you're engaging with? That would just to have that. I think that would help me to also understand the possible business models that you're looking at. Thanks.
And thank you, Member Walters. Member Sayed.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Member Walters for that particular question. Also, it's covered me partially. Let me also thank Mr. Abrams for the presentation and also for the work he's been doing over the years in the department, particularly with regards to being very, very helpful when it has come to the issue of planning and the building of new schools under very difficult circumstances. Within that context of difficult circumstances, I want to ask on slide number 1, the sense I get is that the department is obviously raising serious concern about the challenge of demand, infrastructure demand, that has not necessarily been met, and there's reference to the national fiscal emergency. I wanted to just get a sense in that regard. Could the department possibly give us an indication as to what has led to the infrastructure backlog, just in that regard? Then on slide number 8, and we as public reps been getting these stories, but we want to get it from the department. Is there any truth to the claims made by some construction companies that infrastructure development projects, especially renovations and maintenance projects, are given to the big companies only? Companies that are already well established and already getting a lot of work? And can we perhaps then get in writing details of all the infrastructure development projects that have been entered into, including the BBBE rankings of the service providers? And what are the numbers of the new schools that will be built each year? And how many temporary schools? Thank you.
Thank you, Member Said. I see Member Walters' hand is up again, and then we've got Member Windvogel's hand as well. I think if we'll just take their questions at this stage, then we'll give the team an opportunity to respond to that before we take the next round of questions then.
So, Chair, who's next?
Your hand is up first there, according to this.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, this is a good sign. My imagination is switched on by what you are presenting. So you're doing something well in the educational space once again with the members here. A very simple question, also, and it's aligned to that question that I asked around transversal thinking. To what extent is the department looking at existing social infrastructure, maybe inside and outside of government, that is underutilized, that can be used for education as well? I think there might be space as well to save a lot of resources and extend the usage of our resources. And to what extent is the department exploring using schools not just for, call it the first section of a day, but also the second section of a day? In other words, using school facilities more comprehensively in terms of the classrooms throughout the day. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Walters. Member Windvogel.
Thank you, Chair. Let me also welcome the presentation of the department. Chair, I want to understand why is the rapid school on slide 2, the public and private funding option? Why is the rapid school built not mentioned in the slide? And then when it comes to the Edu Invest, what do you mean of who and what is Edu Invest? Is it a PTY or NGO? Perhaps I miss it. And if so, who is the shareholders or the board members? If I can get that clarity. And then lastly, Chair, how will collaboration schools assist on this challenge of unmet infrastructure demand? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, member. I think I'll give the team now an opportunity to respond to the various questions and issues that have been raised by our colleagues at this stage. So handing over to you, Minister.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the questions. I'm going to hand to Sali Abrahams and the team to respond, and I may make some closing remarks after each round of questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, through you. In the order that I received them, unless I think there are links between the questions, let me acknowledge the questions put to myself. I'll address them to the extent that I can, and I'll offer my colleagues the opportunity to add and substantiate where important to do so. The question of scalability as a design feature, I spoke about high scale and large scale, is an important one. The levers for scalability, we believe, is exactly, Member Walters, what you were pointing to. I think the number of institutions is secondary to what it is that we think we need to do as part of our spatial strategy. And so we speak in the Western Cape about the challenges of urbanization, for example, but also, thinking more broadly about the rural and urban context. It's important for us to sustain and build quality access in the rural context as well. We dealt with the first issue where we thought there were closer, opportunities in the city of Cape Town. Forging a stronger partnership between the city of Cape Town and the Provincial Education Department and other provincial departments is an important design feature. And it's to those matters that we spoke about. It's about land use. There is a spatial development framework that the city of Cape Town, for example, is leading with, like any other municipality. And we think that's limiting in the way that obviously we see our need and our ability to respond to that particular need. In the Western Cape, what's mountain and land, sea and other ecological constraints, we know we've got to work out getting in proximity to where people stay. And at the moment, of course, the challenge is our ability to secure land where people stay. And so aggregating the demand of projects that we've got in the city of Cape Town and then forging that partnership through the Office of the Executive Mayor and his team, finding a way to develop processes that expedites, that creates a context where across the various districts that the city of Cape Town works with, again, potentially unique to the city, we are thinking about land use rights and development approvals and actually creating the capacity to kind of move that forward. That is seen as a big incentive by other developers, private sector and others, who have engaged with us recently as yesterday, who talk about coming into the city of Cape Town, but are completely flustered by and are not confident in the time it takes to move through these land use rights approvals and to get, various plans signed off. Of course, the challenge with schools is not the schools itself, it's operating the schools and then going through the public participation and other processes. So we are thinking immediately about what does this look like at scale, but right now the focus is about forging those links between province and local government. And again, we're extending that now into other municipalities outside of the city of Cape Town, and making sure that as it pertains to the legislative aspects, and particularly around some of the, as we define it, our planning aspects, the spatial development work, that's a key lever. We have a big, almost binding constraint in our ability to move with land, then becomes, to get use rights and to kind of move forward at a fairly decent pace in the timelines that you speak of. The Rapid School Build as a design feature, to Member Windvogel's point, is a construct of us finding fast-tracking mechanisms. The Rapid School Build project is an aggregate pipeline of new school builds that are then contracted directly with a set of service providers, but in its design speaks and profiles what it will take to accelerate the development of new school projects. And in that context, and to the question that Member Walters asked, working with intergovernmentally, working with the legislative context and the land, or particularly the development approvals, that's been a big focus. And so rapid build is defined by that. Our fast track mechanisms is defined by the work intergovernmentally. It's defined by innovative delivery methodologies using a supply chain that can get the job done in a period of time that's that we believe shows the levels of responsiveness. What I mean in English, and this is to Member Said's question. Thank you for the acknowledgement of the efforts, Member. The challenges from a procurement perspective, and again, a design feature of rapid build. So rapid build in itself aggregates projects and capital projects, particularly the larger ones. It is not necessarily an envelope for all infrastructure development. And so our primary focus with establishing new framework contracts with high-grade, large-scale contractors, some of which you alluded to, we have 5 primary contractors that have the kind of resources to deliver on big-scale capital projects. And so those 5 contractors are intentionally engaged to drive school development. So we have a very focused set of projects in the pipeline under the infrastructure agenda that we give to these 5 contractors. For various reasons, as we face service delivery pressures to expand existing schools and build more classrooms, or indeed show better responsiveness in emergency maintenance contexts where we have to, replace roofs and really drive out other aspects of maintenance, we have also engaged out of necessity some of those service providers. And so I think I'm making a link through how do we design for rapid movement, how we design for scaling up, and in a way that brings more partnerships to the table. In our endeavor to move quicker, we think partnerships intergovernmentally is key. We think partnerships with the private sector who builds schools, who understands their focus, and are obviously able to share the risks for that. And we've set up a very specific contracting mechanism called the Framework Contract Agreement, specifically with these 5 bigger companies like GVK and Ho and Inglis, etc. That is not a design and an operating model for all infrastructure work. And so some of the concerns by some smaller contractors who have then said, well, it's crowding out the work that would normally come to us, infrastructure work that's on a smaller scale, like adding a classroom or upgrading a hall, etc. It has been purely a function of it being our only contractual mechanism. WCD itself as an agency doesn't have contracts yet with smaller contracts. And so we're working with the Department of Infrastructure to figure out where best to locate those contracts. We haven't had, as the Department of Education, the mechanism to contract those. And that has impacted some of the work distribution in a sense. But I make that point because intergovernmentally with private sector, and the third dimension to Member Windvogel's question, ensuring that the terms on which we engage is important, and the roles and responsibilities for government vis-a-vis just incentivizing rapid scaling up of capital investment projects. We've brought in an intermediary, and it's Wesgrow. So the EduInvest initiative is an initiative that we've done in partnership with the agency in government responsible for promoting investment into the Western Cape. And so they work within that legislative framework with a focus now on education. And so Wesgrow has assumed a responsibility to front in the contact with the private sector and ensure that the risks and the appetite to invest in the Western Cape, particularly in the education sector, that is surfaced, and that when we talk about innovation, what private sector might be interested in investing in. And so a memorandum of agreement was then forged between the WCD and Wesgrow, sticking within those legislative frameworks, that as Wesgrow promotes investment into the Western Cape, and particularly into the education sector, they've also been helpful and useful in surfacing the right kind of conversations with third parties. So Rapid Build is not on page 2, because Rapid Build is a formulated operating model of how we design an effective approach to do big capital projects, deal with the risks, and obviously engage partnerships and stakeholders. And as I've said, we've got an intermediary that brings the best of their kind of muscle in working with private sector and other agencies, bringing that to the table. And so we're not confused about the roles that government has vis-a-vis creating that context for private sector to see incentive. We do think very acutely, as I scan through and go through the questions, Chair, that actually collaboration schools, which we've now, from an internal perspective to the WCED, it's a public school arrangement that we've legislated that brings private provision or private management to the table in the way that it shares governance. The way that's incentivizing co-investment of infrastructure development, we've premised that the collaboration school model gets a better opportunity for success, and the research and the evaluation to date has shown this. It takes better footing in new school environments. And we haven't pronounced on that public yet, so we're speaking about opportunity to strengthen the collaboration model. But the incentive to move with the collaboration schools have drawn investors to the table that says, well, if you're open to innovative ways of sharing and driving public education, then we will bring what we can bring to the table, which is property and co-investment in the building of those schools. And that relieves some of the capital need and pressure that the education department faces. So there is incentive from one side. We then obviously, as I said, have to manage it from the other side to say, well, not every deal is a good deal. And so we have to really think about on what terms and conditions will we accept a proposal for a private sector party to invest and co-invest into the building of new schools that would end up being governed as part of the collaboration schools model. So it's the co-investment, Member Windvogel, that we're talking about into infrastructure development of itself. Securing investment comes in different forms. There are donors, and donors, Wesgrow in their partnership role, fronts up the donors. We test the context of that donation, or if it's something else. And so the vetting of who's proposing to put money into education, also to the chairs earlier, alluding to how do we actually approach this? Well, tightening up that interface with private sector and prospective partners is a key focus right now. And so vetting anybody that says they want to put money into a building of a new school or into a new kind of aspect of education, we do look at that. But the range of investors, to Member Walters' other question, is quite significant. I mean, we have donors and philanthropists, and so we engage them primarily. Those that are active in the social agenda, development agenda, not just education, but potentially in health, etc. So we've got a close quarters connection with education stakeholders and other social sector stakeholders. But we see the likes of corporates in two contexts. One is private sector interests in independent school education. So the likes of the Advitex and Curos and Sparks, etc., other education service providers, new, current, and emerging, but also non-traditional corporates that are very interested in developing the education sector. I mean, our finance community, finance sector partners, the banks, particularly the insurance and other pension funds, some of the financial industry, big players are very interested in the relationship between, that education plays in building a viable economy, and obviously the skills agenda. And so we're starting to have those conversations with institutional investors. That gets a little bit trickier. And so we've got additionally the support of intermediaries like the multilateral development banks, and particularly National Treasury has facilitated that. But more recently, the World Bank is starting to connect us into conversations and acting as an intermediary with donors that are in the form of institutional investors. So it's quite varied, and our capacity in government to engage with all of them as it stands, of course, is limited, but working with Provincial Treasury and others like the World Bank and other institutions is a part of this. I think the challenge for us in terms of where we are on a starting point is that as we tell the story to various stakeholders, including yourselves, but particularly potential investors, the context for the historical underinvestment needs to be illuminated, and I appreciate the question from member side. I mean, we've had certainly over the last 10 years, and I've acknowledged upfront that to sustain the level of equitable share allocation to this particular program has been significant in the national context. I mean, over 10 years, I couldn't show another province, perhaps, KwaZulu-Natal comes close at hitting double-digit percentage allocations relative to the total vote in terms of what's allocated to program 6 from the equitable share allocation. Provincial departments largely run on conditional grants. The 1.2 billion rand, again, is a historical pattern. The 10% of the 12 billion rand that national DBE allocates to education infrastructure to deal with legacy has not been sufficient. Now, there are operational concerns, and we're not unique in this regard. The construction sector has been under significant strife. I mean, that's one point to point out. We've seen big companies collapse and project commitments unfulfilled, not only in education, but also in education infrastructure. We've seen contractor performance as being one decisive feature with regard to the backlog. Members say that you refer to. Why do we have a backlog if we've gotten 8% of the vote and we've got the conditional backlog grants? Contractor performance one. Consequence management and holding implementing agents to account is another aspect of the operating model that we reflect on, and making sure that monies that are allocated to infrastructure, which is a bit of an anomaly, but I'll make the assumption that the committee is aware that we do have a view that it's out of sync. The equitable share allocation, the 3-year budget framework, is out of sync with infrastructure. Infrastructure is a longer term game, it's a multi-year game, and stability and predictability of finance is very important. When we create instability through taking away funding midterm or interim of the MTEF, it does disrupt the supply chain. It just does. The historical context, in part, is also due to a disrupted supply chain beyond contractor failure. Also, the fairly volatile allocations of monies to the program. In simple terms, when we dealt with COVID, the monies were reduced from the infrastructure budget. The cuts were made in the infrastructure program so that the reprioritization to other policy priorities could be given. It's true also in the current context with the teacher situation. Infrastructure would have contributed 55% of the 2.5 billion rand that was cut to close the financing gap in the Western Cape. So when we cut into the infrastructure budgets, acknowledging that it's a multi-endeavor, it does disrupt supply chains, and it does obviously mean that we have a disrupted kind of trajectory in terms of dealing with backlogs. And so backlogs grow, maintenance backlogs grow as projects are not completed in year and are suspended. And of course, the building of new schools, the long times to get development approvals, from the time we pull the trigger, it takes us 4.5 years in South Africa, 4.7 years on average to build a medium school of 800 learners, according to GTAC in the National Treasury. We've tried to, as a target with Rapid Build, to halve that, 4.7. We've been able to achieve an marginal, good success, and it's early success in doing so. But the key delay there is the upfront planning, design, and the land development work. And we know that these are all contributors to the backlog. So I trust I've dealt with that. I trust I've dealt with the challenge around, the allocation of work and the claim from smaller contractors. It's been for lack of a contractual mechanism with small contractors. There's absolutely no strategy to centralize the procurement of infrastructure services to a select few bigger companies who are going to squeeze the smaller guys for margin. That's not going to happen. We are sensitive to obviously all of our preferences from a procurement perspective, and we will right set that, I think, in the 2022-23 year when we started that framework contract. We're going back to, we acknowledge the pressure we were under, and now we have the opportunity to right set some of these contracts, which we are willing to do. I trust I've dealt with most of the questions that I've had, unless it needs to be augmented by additional inputs from the CFO. I'll extend that opportunity, but certainly, Minister, unless there's something else that you'd want me to touch on, I'll revert back to the chair.
Thanks very much, Mr. Abrams. I think you probably need to catch your breath there for a moment, because that, I think, has been quite a long explanation. But I'm handing over to Minister now to comment, and then I see we've got Member Said and Mr. Eli also ready to make comments.
Thank you, Chair. I would suggest perhaps if we could have Mr. Leon Eli comment, then I think we will have a very comprehensive set of replies to the questions, and of course then we look forward to further questions.
Okay, Mr. Eli.
Yeah, good afternoon, Chairperson. Good afternoon, members of the committee, and good afternoon, Minister. Just in reply to the question that Mr. Said questioned about the BE rankings of the 5 suppliers we have. It was part of the bid requirements that they need to have the necessary BE certificates. And so therefore we are quite satisfied that they meet those requirements. And if the committee wants further information in that regard, we will able to supply the information as well. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mr. Eli. Minister, I don't know if you would like to comment at this stage.
No, I think we have a comprehensive set of replies to the questions. I'm happy to proceed.
Okay, I thank you. I see Member Said, and then maybe I was just wanting to take touch on some of the comments that have been made by members and the responses, and just possibly just take that a little bit further. Member Said.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and my thanks for the responses. My follow-up is just with regards to, I know we've spoken about the issues around contractors and this type of thing, and I specifically looked at the B issue because I'm interested in this matter has come to us, and I know it's also been sitting with the Department of Education and also Public Works. It's around the delays at the Salaris Pass High School in Salaris Village, whether the department intends to continue with the same plans, or are they putting it as part of the rapid school program? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Member Marais.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the department for the presentation. I'm quite in favor of the idea of involving the private sector. I think the private sector brings with it a lot of efficiency and operational efficiency going forward. And I just wanted to know from the department, there was a reference made that there was a measure of School of Skills that were also going to be part of the expansion of the infrastructure going forward. And because it's very important that the schooling system also provide that which the economy needs. There's certain skills that are being demanded from our economy, so we must be aligned with that particular need within the economy. I wanted to know whether the School of Skills are also going to be a big percentage of the schools that will be built, with the private sector, of course, coming alongside. I think it will be a win-win situation if we can deliver on School of Skills, because the importance of developing skills are very important in South Africa, and there's a shortage of that. And then lastly, just wanted to know about the advertising of space. Private sector, I come from the banking sector. They're always looking for advertising space, and that's almost a fixed expense every year is for advertising. Has the department also engaged with the particular commercial or banks in terms of creating space for advertising to generate income for the department and schools going forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Marais. I think also for this, the last aspect we've added on the advertising side. I think if just to possibly add in on some of the conversation that we've had up to date, where I started out and said we've probably got these excited investors outside the candy store and how wanting to get involved. I think the type of scenario that has been painted to me is that there are investors who see the need for schools in particular areas, and I'm using Georgia as an example, where they are saying they would be able to muster up the funding if they were able to get hold of a piece of land. And they, for instance, at this stage, even now, at the beginning of September, if given the opportunity, they would probably have a school that is ready by the beginning of January. Now you've got that type of interest, and then the question I then ask is, how do we cater and deal with that particular interest that you potentially have? And, who do those investors approach so that they can also get the level of explanation that has, for instance, been given to the committee now? So, is there a way that we can put out some briefing document as to the thinking of the department of the long-term planning, and so that one can help those interested parties then to get involved? The next area, and we touched on that, is the whole aspect of the spatial readiness and the land use and all of those aspects where the municipalities can certainly play a role. Is it not the time then to brief the municipalities and to inform them that they need to rapidly identify and not only identify the land that is available, but also to get those land use rights in place to facilitate that investment that needs to take place. So we certainly need to sensitize the market to do that. And I think another aspect really is the difficulty and the constraints that we're seeing at the fiscal level, and how then to bring in the private sector and to bring in those potential investors in the meantime to help us get those schools in place while we are still wrestling with a bigger fiscal constraint issue. So in other words, coming a shifting of the funding that's currently going from a state point of view, in terms of that 8% that we spoke about, that is going into infrastructure, and how one can then make use of the private funding in the meantime to step into that space so that it allows more breathing space both within the department, and also then takes the education or the development of educational infrastructure further a lot faster. So I think that's just possibly part of my thinking there. And then to add on in a way to what Member Marais was indicating, where we sit with roofing and asbestos roofing that needs to be replaced, should the department not be looking at some way of facilitating solar panels on the new roofs that then take place, that need to be built, and that almost becomes an offset for the installer of those solar panels. So, and in effect then come to a deal where that type of power that's been generated assists the schools once again. So I suppose that's just some of my thoughts on on how do we take the process forward from the discussion and the very stimulating discussion that we've been having here today. In other words, to try and find a pathway going into the future. I see that Member Sayed's hand is still up, and then Member Walters' hand is also up. So giving you a chance now to, an opportunity again to make comments.
I think like Member Walters, I also need some training on the online. My apologies. My hand was still up. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, Member Walters.
Chair, before I shoot off another set of questions, because it is indeed a stimulating conversation, I just want to check, is there another round of questions? Are you opening up for another round of questions, or is it only follow-ups?
Look, I don't know if there are additional questions. It may well be that this display that Mr. Abrams has put up here has wowed the audience, and that everybody is as excited as I am to get into this candy store and to encourage everybody to go into the store. So I think go ahead, Member Walters, and then we'll take, I don't see further hands, so then I think we can give, if there are no further hands, then we can probably make this then the last round at this stage.
Okay, Chair, then I'm going to shoot, but if my questions, if there aren't immediate answers available, I'm very happy that, one will keep raising it in the future. One would be, to what extent is encouraging people to also pursue homeschooling? To what extent is that part of the model that you're considering? Then secondly, the land use and attracting investment seems to have jumped out here for me. So my next question is, to what extent is the department aligned to IDP processes? I can just imagine, as an example, typically IDP processes at local government that, amongst other things, deal with land use and zoning, is broken down into particular sites and particular wards. To what extent does that dovetail with the city? I think that is something that relates to my earlier question. It was partially answered. And then my next question would be, we spoke about a lot about infrastructure development. To what extent does the assessment and sustainability of the human infrastructure, the people that you need to run these schools, to what extent does that form of the consideration of attracting other investment and energy into it? And yes, I had another question as well, which I can't recall, but I'm sure I'm going to remember, and I'll ask it in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Walters. I think, just to add on to what you mentioned there, the additional complexity that I believe we have is that you find people living in particular areas and then having that aspirational desire for their children to possibly attend schools that are not located in the immediate vicinity, and that they would like to send the learners to those schools, which I think adds additional pressure then to the department. And then we also have the situation where the WCED will be owning land in particular areas, and those areas may at this stage not be the new growth areas for the location of schools. So to me, I think there's an element of facilitation that needs to take place there. So I think that's, I don't see any hands at this stage. So that's probably the questions that we have right now. So I think if we could hand back to Minister and the team then to possibly respond to these latest questions and comments.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'll again hand over to Sali Abrahams to take us through the responses.
Sure. Thank you, Minister, and through the Chair. Thank you very much for the questions. I interpret them as interest and support. So thank you very much for those. I'll endeavour to answer them to the best, to the extent that I can. In varying order, to Member Said's question, just to reiterate the construct of the Rapid School initiative or Rapid School Build program. It is about accessing support from a range of partnerships to fast track the delivery of big capital investment projects in a way that reduces risk and delivers that sort of value. And so we look at mechanisms in the way that we think we can add value. The program in itself doesn't substitute for, implementing agents that have the task of delivering. So in the case of the example that the member had raised around Salauris is, we put that down to, as it's being described at the moment, a contractor performance issue. And while there might be dispute around which contractor, we have our implementing agent that has the role to oversee the resolution of any disputes or any issues and deal with any contractual failings that would have led to that project being suspended, and it is a project suspended. The question specifically was, would the Rapid Build take that on? We're reflecting on the current active portfolio of projects, of which Salauris is one, Menenberg is another, the School of Skills, Panorama. There are one or two projects that similarly have been suspended or delayed, impacting, of course, in education service delivery that we put down to contractor failure. Now, at this stage, there's no intent to decisively pull them into the Rapid School Build fold, exactly because there's no value we can add just yet until we wade through what is holding up those projects, and we engaging our implementing agent partner, the DOI, in this occasion, to be clear on what the next steps are for Salauris, which might find its dispute resolution, find its way into the courts. So where we can add value, and we think, a project is delayed because of a land approval issue. For example, one of the mechanisms working intergovernmentally with local municipalities, then we will take that on. But at this moment in time, we believe our implementing agent or the implementing agent who might be responsible for the projects in delayed, they would need to decisively deal with that, and then we'll manage and support them to the extent that we need to. I would want to answer Member Walters' first round of questions, and I'm sorry, Chair, that I didn't get to that, around how does one get maximum leverage from existing assets and sweating those assets. I mean, if there was a theory of change around the new school development, it is about driving improved student engagement. Firstly, it must be a place where learners want to come to, so it must offer the kind of education that's interesting and relevant. And so getting children to school is the first challenge, keeping them there is the second challenge, and then making sure they get to the highest level of schooling and learning is obviously, these are development challenges and impacts we want to take forward. And so creating a design where we do actually maximize the use of the school, not just the classroom, but the sports field and the cultural center. That's what I'm talking about, these ancillary facilities. And whether we double up and use double shift of schools, which is what I think the question pointed at, from a design point of view, we're thinking about how can this facility, this asset, be maximally utilized to the benefit of not just the learners, but potentially the communities as well. And there was a question there around what are we learning about shared agreements in working with the Department of Sports and Culture, or indeed with local municipalities who are responsible for sports and recreation. As an example, we were really thinking about how do we get into a space where we look at multi-purpose use of social infrastructure. And it's early days because there are legal and governance frameworks around, for example, the SGB and their call on existing school assets under their jurisdiction. So we can't make decisions on their behalf. There are due consultation processes. But where we can design for it, like our new installation in Lawandle and Wallisdean in Kraaifontein, shared precincts, shared between the Department of Education at the provincial level, with Parks and Recreation in the city of Cape Town, and a local soccer federation. How do we actually, design with some intentionality for mixed purpose and shared use? We do need to be very clear that we'll probably take a little bit of time to get that model going, but there is an ambition to maximize. And then sweat the asset. We do think we want to take quite a nuanced view to, how much load are we putting on it and who carries the risks around it. And that would be my segue to the other question around so if we are to get into a broader conversation and develop value propositions, I want to touch on the question of School of Skills, because it is I'll call it a significant part of the portfolio, given the amount of School of Skills we built over the decade. I mean, to target 7 over the next 3 to 5 years is quite an ambition in the following ways. The learner to teacher ratios and School of Skills, in the way we defined it in the province, of course, under inclusive education, has very, very favorable learner teacher ratios. And so we think the operating costs of that school, we've got 1 or 2 reference points in Bonneville, etc. It's coming closer to 40,000 Rand per child. It's a very expensive endeavor if we think about the all-in costs to serve that particular learner. So we don't yet see the opportunity to scale it. But the thinking right now is that every school, whether it's a skills or vocational school, or indeed a mainstream academic school, every school has to be designed with some purpose to generate quality education. I mean, we need a wider base of really good academic and mainstream schools. So the go-to at the moment and the incentive for private sector to invest into schools of skills is an obvious one because of the local economy link, as we see with more recent examples like Jakes Gerwel or Botha's Alta. So we see the relationship between government and private sector kind of on that interface of what is it that we build, and we see technical skills development is a big focus area at the moment, but it has to be quality. I mean, at the moment, nobody wants to build a school for 160, 170 million Rand, the equivalent operated at an equivalent of 40,000 Rand per child, whoever, doesn't matter who funded. And then the child or the young person doesn't have the credible skills to go into further study or indeed the world of work. I mean, we do need to recognize that to get that environment ready is an expensive endeavor, but if there's a strong economic pool and we got local economy saying we'll hire these kids out of your schools of skills, then we'll push for it. But the emphasis is on quality education, and enough of our endeavors have been about great thinking. It's about implementing, and that means getting a good teacher that can teach a child 12 to 15, 12 to 16 years old and impart the education kind of process, but also deal with the social challenges that might come with running a school that attracts that demographic of learner in terms of discipline and behavior, etc. I love the question around advertising space. I mean, we've got fixed eyes locked on not just obviously the physical perimeter and the physical aspects of space at schools with billboards, etc., but in the electronic age as well with report cards and other electronic communication medium, using advertising space as a revenue generation mechanism to help schools deal with inflation. I mean, those are really exciting ideas that we are giving in partnership, giving space to, and Westgrow particularly, again, is facilitating, working with EdTech and not just EdTech, but also other private sector partners around how we might help develop systems where, not just physical, spaces at schools, where we can actually sell advertising space as a revenue mechanism for schools. But that, again, needs to be controlled and needs to be well designed. How do we get this process operationalized and then get it familiarize potential partners to it? To the chair's question, I mean, at the moment, again, Westgrow plays that role now, interfacing on any prospective partnerships and proposals that we receive, including, for example, the ones in George that you referred to, but also a little bit wider. That starts with, we're happy to, and we see the opportunity to invest into a new school. And I assume for the purposes of your question, Chair, you're not talking about donations and you're not talking about private schools. You're talking about philanthropic or corporate investors wanting to put money into the development of public schools, or indeed, driving the full build of schools if land was made available. Again, within the legal and regulatory framework, these are options that we're exploring. The law will guide us in this regard in terms of making sure that the money's coming to not just the building of the school, but the assumptions around how will the school operate and who will fund the operations, including the teachers and the teaching and learning resources of that school. So now we've got a more nuanced view around what makes for a good proposal for co-investing into the building of new schools. And so Wesgrow and the WCED, more recently, we've established through my office, a project office that will receive all of those proposals and then build capacity and work with potential partners around what the criteria would be that we'd use in order to evaluate and successfully approve and give money from our side into co-investment proposals. Again, early days, but we are structuring the systems so that we can move forward as we anticipate more potential proposals coming through the door. In terms of spatial readiness, great question. Obviously, land is a strategic asset for government. And I don't just mean provincial land under the custodianship of DOI, but I also mean city-owned land. Designating it for education has implications, as I spoke about earlier, just the public consultation around the impact on roads and transport and bulk services. Right now, we've signaled certainly to the municipalities that before we were talking the language of and the decision tree of where we have land, where we have money, we'll then build a school. Well, now we're talking about more of a, let's call it demand-driven strategy. We know we want to build quality schools. If we're driving, for example, a schools of skills, one of the 7, Member Maria, that I referred to earlier, over the next 3 to 5 years, if I was able to pinpoint that to George or Mossel Bay, then the incentive that comes with us potentially talking about what might it take to unlock that land and accelerate it, thinking about more transparently talking about development charges with bulk services and electricity. Presumably that will be needed in a school of skills context. It's a rapidly maturing conversation intergovernmentally that is needed. So it's not just on the surface, if you put money on the table, we'll jump at it. The responsible processes we're now institutionalizing is, what are the questions we want to ask around what happens in the short term, and then sustainably, how do we look after this investment and make sure that the education department, for example, doesn't become the horse in this proverbial horse and cart in terms of picking up all the fast mover charges. We certainly don't have the budget to be able to pay for building of roads and building of sewage, etc. We will consider working in partnership with municipalities when we need to get in first, but that would be on a case-by-case basis. And then so spatial readiness, we appreciate the districts and the municipalities plan on a slightly different kind of operating model, a revenue generation model. And so we need to think quite openly around how we partner in that regard, acknowledging we have some work to do to contribute to bigger development, but we certainly cannot be seen like to be any other developer and get billed for, as I say, all of these bulk services that comes immediately into it. And then as I go to, again, to Member Maria's question, I think different schooling types, and you referenced homeschooling, sir, but I think there's the challenge we're responding to is not necessarily, it's offering in a school choice environment more options. Homeschooling is obviously a feature of it, but the focus at the moment is this notion of institution. It is, in the South African context, especially, very difficult endeavor to build schools and build social infrastructure. And so the accuracy with which we have to now look at demand, and the point the chair makes is an important one. As I said before, we were guided by where we have land and where we have money to build a school. We're moving on from that and thinking more about demand. What does the citizen want? What does the community, learner community want? And if it is schools of skills, let's think all the way through that process. What will it take to build an institution like that and run it sustainably, at least for 10 to 15 years, which is the initial part of the life cycle management and the services it needs. And think really carefully through what it might cost to do so. So I think we're maturing in terms of our planning paradigm that talks about not just short-term opportunities, we've got land, we've got money, but now we're thinking about making multi-year investments into quality schooling and leveraging, as I think Member Maria and others have said, the expertise, the technical expertise and the capability from the private sector to help us think through that make good decisions in that regard. Minister and Chair, unless you'd want to augment that, Minister, I think, Chair, I think I've addressed most of the questions that came through that particular round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think we've again responded comprehensively to the questions, and we look forward to any further questions from the committee.
Thanks very much, Minister. Thanks very much for your team. I don't see hands. I'm also from the old school, where I know that the teaching fraternity normally only worked up till 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock when schools closed, and then usually had relaxing afternoons. So I say that tongue in cheek. But if I don't see any further hands at this stage, and so therefore I think it is time to thank the team for being with us and really giving us a wonderful tour through the planning process and the forward thinking, and that certainly has been a very stimulating presentation to all of us, and I therefore wish to thank you for the time that you spent with committee. And at this stage, we can, as committee, we can just deal with our further matters, and we can release yourselves to get back to the rest of your busy days, no doubt. And so thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Sali, and thank you, Mr. Eli, for being with us today. It's really been a wonderful time that we've spent with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you to the members of the committee. And from me, thank you to the team who presented.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Benai.
Thanks. I think as the team leaves there, we can then move on to the next part of our meeting. And thank you very much to Ms. Wasim Musa for getting all of this arranged and being with us today. I saw your hand there, Member Marais.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for accommodating me today. I'm not a normal member on this committee, but I thought it was interesting to when I looked at the agenda, and just wanted to know if I could stay on this meeting or whether I also need to vacate, seeing that I'm not a member, an official member of this particular committee.
I think you're welcome. You're welcome to stay. I think the rest of the committee will then just deal with the rest of the agenda. And that really relates to sets of minutes that we need to consider and need to adopt, and then deal with any resolutions flowing from this meeting. I think I'm going to just hand over to Ms. Hassan Musa then, just to guide us into the next part of this.
Hi, Chair. Thank you. Through you, are we heading to the recommendations part of the meeting before we go to the minutes?
Yes, we can certainly deal with that.
Sure. I've just highlighted one or two. One from Member Syed. He wanted all of the infrastructure projects that the WCD has had. I'm not sure if it's for this financial year or for the 4-year plan. Also to include the triple B companies that have been approved by WCED, and all new schools to be built during this financial year. We can also request the UAMP from them, which will show the schools that are looking at being built or maintenance being done to it for the financial year and beyond. That is as far as what I've captured. I'm not sure if Member Syed wants also a report on St. Lowry's Pass High School's delay, or the answer from Mr. Abrams was suffice?
Yes, I think before Member Said perhaps answers or addresses some of those issues, I think what we must also just be aware of is from what my recollection in the APR, in the annual performance plan, there was an indication there, a long list of the projects that are being envisaged and are underway, and the state of where a lot of those projects were. That was at the beginning of this financial year, so I don't know if we want an update on that or whether we first want to examine that document before we ask for additional information. Member Sayed.
Chairperson, my apologies. I was having a network problem. I just wanted to know what was the response to my question on the issue around the building of the school in Salauris. I didn't capture that actually. Thank you.
I think from what I understood is that it's a matter that's being dealt with at present. And I think they are obviously trying to resolve that matter, and I think they indicated that it could also end up in court. So, if my recollection is correct from that perspective, but you know, certainly if we would like to get that in writing, then that's fine.
Thanks. If we could get that in writing, please. Thank you.
Fine. I think if we can do that. Are there any other aspects that we should add to our resolutions or recommendations, colleagues?
Chairperson,
Member
I'm
Walters.
covered.
Thanks, Member Boyson.
Yeah, Chair, maybe it's sort of self-explanatory, but I think it's important that with this particular space that the department is dealing with, that we regularly invite them back to brief us. I just think it's going to be important. It is in fact, I think the future of Western Cape education is actually what we're talking about, and it would be remiss of us not to constantly keep in touch in this around these issues.
Yes, I would agree with you. I think there's also, you know, we must give the department a huge amount of credit for that they have undertaken, and that level of planning, that level of strategic planning, and looking at accommodating various models within the system, I think is of huge value. And I'm also not too sure to what extent the broader public and the broader potential investors would really understand all of that. So it is something that we also need to encourage them to publicize and to to make the public a lot more aware of the excellent work that they were doing. Okay, I'm not seeing any further response over there, so I think are we generally covered? It would certainly appear to be so. Okay, does that give you clear direction, Masasa Musa?
Yes, Chair. Thank you so much.
Okay, can we then move on to the consideration and adoption of the draft minutes of the 27th of August 2024? I think, as you will recall, last week we said that we'd be dealing with these minutes today. So I think if we can just pass that through the screen here, and we are expecting the eagle eyes of the team then to have a look if they are satisfied and are ready to adopt this. And the first hand will then get the prize for adopting these minutes. I think you can roll up. So that was the meeting that we dealt with the budget and the shortfall that is going to be experienced this year, and the levels of difficulty. We'd also then had that list of information that we'd requested. So that is there as well. And then we get to the resolution at that stage. So I see Member Walters' hand.
Chair, I propose adoption.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Member Kaiser-Philander.
Chairperson, I second the proposal by Member Walters.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So that, I think, deals with the 27th of August. We can then move to the draft minutes of the 3rd of September 2024. And that is now on the screen. And at that meeting, we dealt with the National School Nutrition Program and then the Learner Transport Scheme as well. We can then move on to, we spoke about we had that presentation about the feeding scheme and the learners at that stage, and there was a certain amount of information that was then also requested at that stage. If that is acceptable, if we can also then just move for adoption there. We got Member Walters.
Sorry, Chairperson.
Yes, was that Member Philander? Or
no, my apologies. I'll go after the members that hands are already up. Thank you, Chair. Sorry.
Okay, so Member Walters, is that proposing? And then Member Stevens?
Yes, Chair, my early problems with connectivity is clearly solved. I propose adoption.
Member Stevens?
I second that, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Member Kaiser-Philander?
In order, Chairperson. Thank you. I'm happy.
Okay. So I think that deals with that item. Are there any further matters that we need to deal with at this stage, or can we all go and have a cup of tea or coffee at this stage? I see no response, so I think that would indicate to me that we are all happy and we are ready to adjourn this meeting, and I accordingly adjourn now at 15:07. I think enjoy the rest of the afternoon and the evening. Thanks everyone for your participation and being with us today. And thanks to our procedural officer for guiding us through this process. So thank you. That concludes the meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Thank you, Chair.